was to talk to us. He's been watching this CPC partnership all these years there, and we wanted to have a person representing World Vision to come and share with us a little bit from the outsider's view what has happened here at CPC, what it looks like from the outside looking in. And so with that, I want to invite Steve to come forward and just to address this group.
This is a real treat. I don't have to try too hard and be too creative to think back 3 years ago, actually speaking in your services and talking about all that was going on in the community of Hakai. And I remember that especially because that was the day in which I had the year-end report, which had been handed to me to crib a little bit before I stepped up so I'd know what I was saying. You would know what I was saying, and we'd all have kind of this, you know, back and forth understanding relationship. And I was handing it up and I just kept shaking it like this. I said, this is what has happened in the last 10.5 years, and this is so exciting. And as I did that, John Good, sitting like where you're sitting, Jeff, he's sitting there doing this. This is not a good symbol when someone is speaking. So between services, after the first service, I said, what's the problem? And he said, no, that's what CPC did last year. And I looked at it and I said, so that's not 10 years of activity? He said, no, that's 1 year's worth of activity. And I just need to tell you, it was kind of an aha moment for me as I began to think what this community had done with World Vision and the community of Hakai. And the powerful example that you would set, really for a lot of churches around the country. I tend to share that story a lot because I think sometimes people need to understand, well, what kind of drop in the bucket is this church going to do in a community halfway around the world? The CPC has proven an example a lot. A life-changing transformational activity taking place because the community fell in love. Good journeys begin with directions, but great ones begin with a vision and a deep calling. I was thinking of some examples. The Apostle Paul is doing his thing, and then he gets this Macedonian vision. And it just changes the course of history, and you and I are sitting here as an example, as really an arm and a leg because of that original vision. Thomas Clarkson wins the Upper Latin Prize in Cambridge, and on his way home after doing research on slavery, suddenly falls off his horse, and he just gets this vision in his head. Someone should see the calamity of slavery to its end. No one's heard of Thomas Clarkson, but they've certainly heard of the man he awakened, William Wilberforce. Mother Teresa said that if she hadn't had that vision of walking over the first leper and realizing that if I walk over this one, I walk over everyone. She hadn't had that calling, that little whisper in the ear that said, this is something I need to do, then we wouldn't have had the Sisters of Charity, and I certainly wouldn't have a great illustration. Tonight we're celebrating a great journey. It began with a vision and a calling, and some of you know this story because you lived it. I just kind of looked back in some World Vision notes, actually went back in some of our archives just to refresh myself. I'd heard this story numerous times, but I wanted to make sure I had it. In 1981, a couple of staff from World Vision approached a small group of Edina senior pastors. Their message, Arthur Rauner is quick to tell, said it was like a Macedonian call. People are dying in the Horn of Africa. That's what they said. Will you come over and help us? Those of you who were around at the time remember it was a bad time to look for ecumenism. And this would mean traveling to places that people had never heard of, let alone find them on a map. This would mean that in this time when you gave money to denominations, if you were in that denominations, actually thinking outside the fold and doing it together as a community of churches. World Vision was a virtual unknown in this area. In fact, I just met a gentleman here who actually was doing some of the early films. His father worked for World Vision back in the late 50s, and he was actually handing out flyers. He may have been the only man. You may have been the only man in this community that knew World Vision back then. But what are you doing? Why would a church get involved with that? In 1982, 16 people from 5 churches, and when Arthur was asked about this, this is the way he described them. It was a fundamental Baptist, a liberal Catholic, a Stoic Lutheran church, an in-between Congregational Presbyterian church, and they banded together calling themselves the Edina Group. The Edina Group. That sounds like an outplacement treatment center, but that's what they called themselves. What they lacked in creativity, they certainly made up for in spirit, because some amazing things began to happen. You can imagine the Stairs when they came back from their northern Kenya trip, and over an Easter offering, they raised together $360,000. That's 80 money, not 2008. Let's hear it for vision trips. Out of the passion that ignited on that trip, a framework of 5 churches of working together began to get molded, wired together, and they decided that there maybe was a better name, and so they called themselves the Christian Volunteers of Minnesota. Organizing began in earnest as the impact of communities began to grip entire communities and churches. No one puts bounds on the extent of what Christ followers can do when they get this vision thing going, when they have a dream. The footprint began to grow, and invitations for the Christian volunteers began to venture out to other places like Ethiopia, South Africa, Tanzania. CVOM was instrumental in adding muscle to the efforts to reclaim the lives during the Ethiopian famine. And that was also a place that opened the eyes of a rock star out of Ireland. That's where Bono actually got his vision. This community was catching a vision as well. Up to that point, I think it would be safe to say that if someone said short-term ministry, you would be thinking of things, encouragement acts like Bible schools, home building, maybe a little bit of repair of sidewalks, painting a wall. The Christian Volunteers, obviously hardy Minnesotans, began to talk about repairing pipelines, dams, wells, catchments, greenhouses, experimental farms, and peacemaking. According to the transparent history of the group, as I read this thing, I was appreciative that it wasn't all glory story. I began to read about false starts, wrong turns, dead ends, cross-cultural sensitivity and understanding that just went south in a couple of cases, where etiquette wasn't quite what it should have been, and so people needed to be moved to other places. What's important is that they didn't forget their call. People are dying in Africa. Will you come over and help them? And so the volunteers just proved faithful. That's what they did. And while CVOM continued to send ecumenical teams to Africa, inspired churches began to see greater commitment with defined communities. And that's where this particular church comes in. Because you fell in love with a marginalized community of Rakai and others within the region. And what now the world knows as the AIDS capital of Uganda, the ground zero of the global AIDS fight. And now years later, our journey takes a brief breather right here. And that's why I'm here tonight, to honor you. Tonight we take a moment, in a sense, to contemplate just what has happened and what will happen in the next 2.5 years in the Rakai community as transitions begin in this critical part of our journey. And tonight it's our hope to begin a process of transition and to prepare you, the donors that are outside this community, and our community in Rakai as well, that's actually been going on for about 2.5 years, to a point in the future when Rakai can be transitioned to a sustainable community apart from World Vision's involvement, regular community development and interventions. As an active participant in the process, we want to make sure that you're not only well-versed, in some senses you become a bit of an expert on how a community runs and how a community transitions, so that you feel the excitement of what's happening in this community.